Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of Season 10 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Well, hello and welcome back, Ray.
Thank you so much. Before we get to that, listeners, we are delighted that the podcast continues to be supported by Deep Pool. Did you know that spending 30 seconds could save you multiple hours across the rest of your professional life? Because it can. Head over to deep-pool.com and read more about their product Cure, that's Kure, which is giving their clients a single automated multi-jurisdictional onboarding system, which takes all the pain, costly manual errors, and potentially disastrous onboarding jeopardy and replaces it with simplicity, real-time information updating, and optimized and validated data.
Oh, well, that sounds like the cure to your FATCA and CRS woes, Ray.
Unforgivable, Graham. Look, listeners, you can find out more, pun free, I promise, at deep-pool.com.
Yes, now, I've just said welcome back because
Mm,
you chose quite a week to go on holiday, Ray. Bank
mm.
accounts have been all over the news.
Yeah, well, I was only in Albania, not at the other end of the solar system, Graham, so I wasn't entirely insulated from the news while I was away. And it looked like it was more to do with the absence of a bank account from where I was.
Yes, which is not Uranus, the other end of the solar. I'm not going to go down that route, Ray. I'm going to stop now and say I think you're probably right. And it's generated a lot of heated debate and a wide spectrum of opinions.
From the, you might almost say, from the infra dig to the ultra right.
Oh, I see what you did there, Ray. Spectrum.
Mm.
Very good. And I've got to say, it has been a while since I've heard anyone use infradig. Where does that come from?
Latin, Graham. Infra dignitatem, beneath one's dignity.
Well, I never.
Mm.
And to be honest, beneath one's dignity is a definition which we apparently need to keep revising every year.
That is regrettably the case. Yeah, I mean, it would appear to be one of the consequences of the celebrity-led social media revolution. That nothing which garners a few clicks can be considered infradig. But
Mm,
we digress, as is so
no.
often the case. Should we recap the main elements of this story?
Well, I think we should, but I think we need to be clear which story we're addressing because
Mm.
whilst Mr. Farage has attracted all sorts of publicity, both pro and anti, this episode is not really about him, is it?
No, although of course he'd love it to be. Um, he's
Yeah.
simply become the catalyst, of course, for a much more important conversation, and one that we have covered in some respects before, but which is still clearly relevant.
Exactly. Okay, so the starting point was Mr. Farage going public on an as yet unnamed bank when he went public, writing to tell him that his business was no longer welcome and they were going to close his account. He then tried to find, apparently, someone else to bank him, and according to him, he was turned down by everybody.
I hear at one point he was claiming he'd have to leave the country in order to maintain his finances.
I'm trying not to smile. Yes, something of a volte-face, if that's
Oh.
how you pronounce it. But maybe we're best steering clear of the more overtly political stuff.
Yes, I think so. I will steer clear of accusing him of crying wolf over leaving the country threats.
Yeah.
Um, so, anyway, it eventually emerged that Mr. Farage banked with Coutts and Co., the well-known private bank, which is a subsidiary of NatWest Group.
He did. And what also emerged following him filing a subject access request, the other type of SAR, was the file of information used by the bank's reputational risk committee in coming to that decision.
And I chose to prioritise time with the family over time spent reading
Don't
about
make me.
Mr. Farage, Graham. But I mean, have you sort of taken that bullet for us? Have you read it all?
I have, Ray, all 40 pages.
Well, I shall organise a medal for you, Graham. What did it
Thank
tell you?
you. Well, first of all, that Mr. Farage's dealings with the bank and its staff were always polite, respectful, and never a cause for concern.
Oh, that's very good.
Well, it is, and it would appear that none of his transactions had ever raised a concern either.
Even though I think I'm right in saying there were references to Russian connections he maintained.
Well, the file makes it clear that these were at best dubious in terms of financial connections, other
Oh,
than a few appearances on Russia Today, or I believe it became RT.
gotcha.
Hmm.
So no bungs from the Kremlin then.
None that Coutts could trace going through their accounts with him, Ray? No.
Hmm. So where did this whole Russia thing come from then?
Mainly press reporting on his comments around, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and just a general feeling of his being pro-Russian and consorting with another name redacted in the report, pro-Russian or pro-Russians.
And this is a theme right through the report, isn't it?
Well, yes, there is a lot of reportage on his very public and controversial nature. But it also goes to great pains to point out there was no suggestion he had transcended controversy into illegality.
So no suggestion at all that he'd broken the law then.
None at all.
Hmm. So are we saying in summary that they exited him because they didn't like him or didn't like his views?
Well, oddly, it also says several times that his business, on repayment of his mortgage, which he repaid early, would fall below their usually accepted levels and he was going to be exited on commercial grounds.
But that's in contrast, isn't it, to the fact that most of those 40 pages had nothing to do with the value of his business and everything to do with the nature of his politics.
That's absolutely right, Ray. And it's quite difficult to maintain a sense of balance when you're reading that, when overwhelmingly the evidence presented to the Rep Risk Committee was reputational and seems to be mainly at odds with the diversity and inclusiveness policies of the bank.
Now, I don't know how many customers Coutts have, and I don't expect they tell me if I ask them either, but
No,
it's difficult to believe that all of the rest of those customers, however many there are wholly supportive of the bank's diversity and inclusiveness policies.
I think you're spot on, but probably none of the rest of those customers are quite as high a profile as Mr. Farage.
Hmm. So he wasn't being offboarded so much for his views, but for the very public nature of them.
Well, yes, exactly. Which you might counter argue made it easier to manage the relationship, being very public about his views, than if they were kept mainly very private.
Hmm. Which brings us, I suppose, to the thorny question of whether the bank is entitled to chuck you out because it doesn't agree with you.
And that's where it gets tricky because, well, let's be honest, Coutts is a pretty exclusive club, not one that we're going to be members of anytime soon. Well, I'm not, I don't know about you.
Well, no, 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 absolutely.
So while there is a right enshrined in law for everyone to have access to a bank account, it doesn't necessarily follow it has to be the particular bank that you personally want to have an account with.
No, so the payment accounts regulations of 2015 make it a requirement that all UK adults have a right to open what's known as a basic bank account, although not all banks actually offer them. And let's just be clear, a basic bank account is one where you only have a debit card and no access to credit, making them from the bank's point of view relatively low risk from a, credit risk point of view.
Yeah, and listening to that description, I think it's pretty clear that the Coutts account does not fall under a basic bank account definition.
Well, quite so.
No. So there was no legal requirement for Coutts to maintain the account.
No, although you could also counter argue from the reputational risk point of view that it's done more to tarnish Coutts' reputation by exiting Mr. Farage than keeping him.
Well, I agree. I'm not sure Coutts can be blamed for the views of all of its customers because they've all got to bank somewhere after all.
And I'd rather it was somewhere that's properly run.
I completely agree. So it's a very finely balanced judgment. But of course, the story didn't end there, did it?
Oh, it never does where Mr. Farage is concerned, does it? No, the BBC subsequently carried a story from a well-placed source to say that Mr. Farage was exited for purely commercial reasons.
Well, which he was, sort of.
Hmm. And if all the report had said was that Mr. Farage, having repaid his mortgage, had fallen below the minimum threshold to retain his accounts with Coutts, that probably would have been an end to it.
Yeah, but including 38 or so pages of, quote, adverse media very definitely blurred the lines.
Especially as that only represents adverse media to some people and entirely legitimate stuff to others.
Absolutely. And I suppose we ought to add for the record at this point that we actually passionately disagree with Mr. Farage pretty much on everything he stands for, but we do not agree with silencing opposing or dissenting or differing voices.
No, quite so. But to return to the story, things started to unravel when it transpired that the well placed source for the BBC story was none other than Alison Rose, the CEO of NatWest.
Yeah, who had confirmed to Simon Jacks, BBC reporter, that Mr. Farage did indeed have a Coutts account and at the very least implied that it was being closed for commercial reasons.
Instantly breaching one of the most important rules around banking, which is that you don't disclose customers' sensitive information, even if the customer themselves chooses to do so.
Which can be very unfair at times when the customer is accusing the bank of all sorts of nefarious actions, but the bank is unable to defend itself.
Sounds familiar, Graham. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's called information asymmetry. One side either doesn't know or cannot provide a proper response to claims from the other side.
And sadly, that silence is often seen as an admission of guilt.
It's not too hard to read into this a desire to defend the bank from what was seen as a gratuitous attack, which led to this understandable but quite egregious mistake.
And her resignation.
Well, yeah. I mean, we all make mistakes, but when you're at the top of the tree and the mistake is one of the most basic you can make, I don't think there was a lot else she could do.
I think you're right, but I wish that was applied more generally. For example, in government or at
Oh,
cabinet level, or
imagine, yeah.
ah, you know, taking accountability for things you do wrong. Anyway, the consequence of all this is the government bringing in the bank bosses, hinting at legislation to stop accounts being closed willy-nilly, and introducing a 90-day minimum between advising of an imminent account closure and then actually closing it.
Now, I'm not sure we need such a heavy handed approach, but we've spoken many times about the potential folly of de risking and how it can often have the opposite effect to that was intended.
Yeah, law of unintended consequences.
Mm.
It's a funny old business that the one thing banks seem to find most difficult, though, is actually detecting financial crime in progress.
It's almost as though the focus on reputational issues and adverse media is displacement activity.
I think you make an important point. To me, the whole point of gathering adverse media is to inform the monitoring teams to help them identify potentially suspicious transactions that the adverse media might help them to make sense of.
And not to decide if you're a bad egg who shouldn't be with the bank in the first place.
Well, yes. I mean, I guess all banks are at liberty, other than with basic bank accounts, to make some sort of decision. But you can hardly say, Ray, that Coutts would have been unaware of who they were taking on at the outset of the relationship.
Well, yeah, and indeed, they maintained it throughout his time as a high risk pet, up to and including giving him the mortgage that precipitated all these issues when it was finally repaid.
Which does help to reinforce the fact that it was ultimately a commercial decision, or at least one made easier by the fact that he no longer owed the bank any money.
Hmm. I'm not sure anyone comes out of this looking particularly good, but we ought to focus on the learning points, really.
Yes, we should. So, what do you take from this?
Well, First, be very clear and very balanced in your judgments and how you choose to record them. It doesn't look great when there's pages and pages of adverse media and only a few lines of mitigation. There was very little from what we might regard as the right wing press, which is largely supportive of Mr. Farage.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And also that your job in rep risk is not to apply your own standards, but to ensure all aspects are properly covered and recorded.
Yeah, quite. Two, be very clear that you're simply recording what others say and ensure it's relevant to the committee. Don't just include stuff because it's there.
Yeah, I always apply the standard way of would I defend this publicly, whatever I put in a report, in front of a regulator?
Yeah, I think that's a good approach. I mean, including salacious, biased, or highly opinionated material that isn't directly relevant to the risk of maintaining a client account may be easier if you think the report will always remain confidential. But as this case shows, a subject access request can extract information from the darkest recesses and hold it to the light.
I think you're right, and you need to make sure the Rep Risk Committee has exceptionally clear terms of reference, which are also echoed in the terms and conditions provided to customers at account opening.
You can't hold people to a different standard to the one that they agreed to at the start of the relationship.
Yeah, or if you do change them, you must make sure your customers explicitly know and understand what those changes are and have the opportunity to change their business accordingly if they don't agree.
Yep. Three, never disclose customer information to someone outside the bank unless it's a duly authorised regulator or a law enforcement officer.
Yeah, and definitely not an off the record briefing with a journalist.
There's no such thing as an off the record briefing with a journalist, Graham, and not if it relates to one of the most publicity attracting individuals in the current political scene. No.
No, no. Anything else, Ray?
Well, yeah, I mean, PEPs. Farage was about to be declassified altogether, but he'd already been reduced to the lowest level of PEP risk. I mean, in his circumstances, that seems reasonable, although other banks might have taken the view that he maintains sufficient political influence and to keep him at some level of PEP status going forward.
As I think events of the last week or two have probably shown to be completely correct.
Yeah.
But there you go. But to be clear, though, that does not equate to criminal. Overwhelmingly, PEPs are not criminals. Ultimately, it's down to how well you understand their transactions. If their transactions are legal and understandable, your risk is low. If your transactions with that PEP are not understandable, then your risk is pretty high.
Yep, I agree with that. So we've come to the point, really, where the very word PEP conjures up all sorts of images, most of which are wrong. They definitely need closer monitoring, but it shouldn't be with the expectation of finding criminality. It should be with the expectation that should criminality happen, you will find it, but you don't expect it.
Oh, I like that, Ray. That's really nicely put, and it's a fine but important difference. A bit like I always think the difference between what's in the public interest and what is interesting to the public.
Oh, two very different things, you're right. One further aspect of all this for me, Graham.
Go on then.
Well, although this wasn't seemingly about the other type of SARS, suspicious activity reporting, and any other law enforcement reports, that the flavour of the government's response here looks like it might make an already tricky job even more so.
Yes, and I suspect you're talking about the requirement not to tip off.
Well, exactly that. The legal requirement is there so that the customer doesn't become aware that they're under investigation for financial crime or that you've made a report in relation to them. We'll have to see how any new requirements are worded, but I can see that might become even more precarious for banks under the new regime, who might even decide that the bar for reporting suspicions has moved higher.
And that really would not be a good outcome, would it?
Not in many scenarios, no.
No.
But anyway,
Yeah.
for now, I think that's probably where we're going to have to leave it to wait and see what develops.
Hmm.
What's next, Graham?
Ray, the indomitable Dan Needle has been writing about tax fraud and Companies House, which is, of
Oh,
course, a
yeah.
subject dear to our hearts. So I thought we should provide for our listeners a précis of what he's been writing about.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it.